The environment changes our biochemistry. The biochemistry changes our behavior. People seem to think that we have, quote, free will. Einstein knew we did not have free will. Free will is a construct that has been created by society to punish criminals. The fact of the matter is, our hormones tell us what to do. And so my interest has been in how does the environment change our biochemistry, and how does that ultimately impact on what we think and do in the world.
Welcome to the Mind Health 360 show. I'm Kirkland Newman, and if you, your loved ones, or clients suffer from mental health issues such as depression, anxiety, insomnia, poor memory, poor attention, mood swings, exhaustion, etc., I interview the leading integrative mental health practitioners from around the world to help you understand the root causes of these symptoms, many of which may surprise you, and suggest solutions to help you heal. If you like this interview, please do subscribe and forward to others who might find it helpful. If you want further information, please go to www.mindhealth360.com or find us on social media. I'm very excited to welcome Professor Robert Lustig from California.
Thanks for having me.
Very excited to have him here for the second time, actually. And Robert is currently actually in Paris on a sabbatical, and we're very lucky to have him across the pond. And just to introduce him again, Professor Robert Lustig is a Professor Emeritus of Paediatrics, Division of Endocrinology at the University of California, San Francisco. He specializes in the field of neuroendocrinology with an emphasis on the regulation of energy balance by the central nervous system. His research and clinical practice is focused on childhood obesity and diabetes. Dr. Lustig holds a bachelor's in science from MIT, a doctorate in medicine from Cornell University Medical College, and a master's of studies in law from UC Hastings College of the Law. Very impressive. Very few doctors who are also lawyers, essentially.
Well, I'm not a lawyer. I can't sue. I can talk to people who can.
Okay, well, that's good enough. That's good. And his New York Times bestselling book, Fat Chance, Beating the Odds Against Sugar, Processed Food, Obesity, and Disease, Robert documents both the science and the politics that have led to the current pandemic of obesity and chronic disease. In his latest book, which is the one I'm particularly fascinated about, The Hacking of the American Mind, Dr. Lustig explains his view that our current corporate-driven societies are hacking our bodies and minds to pursue pleasure instead of happiness, fostering today's epidemic of addiction and depression. So one of the things I'm particularly interested in is the link between mental health, hormones, and neurotransmitters. And so just to give you a little bit of background, when I had postpartum depression after the birth of both my boys, essentially I was given antidepressants, I was given sleeping pills, I was offered all sorts of antipsychotics and different drugs, very exciting, various different options, shall we say. But not one of my doctors, and I had quite a few at the time, ever suggested that we check my hormones or that we check my neurotransmitters or that we check any sort of nutritional levels. And at the time, I didn't really know any better, but I struggled a lot with the antidepressants. I had a lot of side effects. And over time, through my own personal journey of exploration, I then talked to nutritionists, I talked to endocrinologists, I talked to functional medicine doctors, integrative mental health specialists who I sort of found out there. And this was back in 2011, and there were fewer than there are now. But I realized that, what probably should have happened in my case is that somebody should have tested my hormones and my nutrition status and my lifestyle and looked at the different biochemical imbalances in my body that were creating my depression, my anxiety, and my insomnia. And so I sort of started Mind Health 360 to raise awareness amongst lay people about the importance of addressing the root causes of common mental health disorders, and looking at all the factors that impact your mental health, from your lifestyle, your sleep, your exercise, your stress levels, to your nutrition status, to your levels in hormones and neurotransmitters, your toxic sort of BPAs, your heavy metals, etc. And my argument is that I don't think that you can treat mental health issues sustainably without looking at all these factors that impact your mental health. And so what I'm particularly interested in talking to you about is hormones and neurotransmitters. As a neuroendocrinologist, these are your specialty areas, and their impact on mental health. Now, in your book, Hacking the American Mind, which is absolutely brilliant and, spans a whole number of issues and the politics and the, biochemistry and the science, and also has solutions as to what you can do. You talk a lot about the relationship between dopamine, serotonin, and cortisol, essentially, those three. But what I wanted to do was take a step back and say, in general, maybe you could talk to the layperson a little bit about, what are hormones? What are neurotransmitters? How do they impact our mental health? Maybe that's the best way to start. And then I'll have some more specific questions about what we can do about them and which ones are the key ones, essentially, for our mental health and which ones really impact levels of depression, anxiety, stress, insomnia, pleasure, etc., happiness.
First of all, you've just given the whole talk.
No.
Of course, Kiki. You are well steeped in this. You know why this is, what the story is, but clearly the viewer doesn't. And so let me try to make it a little bit more obvious and apparent. The brain controls hormones. Hormones control the brain. That's why I'm a neuroendocrinologist. Maybe I give the audience a quick narrative of my 40 years in medicine.
That would be great.
One sentence. I went from brain tumors to obesity, to insulin, to metabolic syndrome, to sugar, to addiction, to technology. Now, those things, that's a game of telephone that really doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Brain tumors to technology. But in fact, each of those is connected to the previous one through mechanisms. I basically went where the data took me.
Yeah.
I've always been interested in how the brain controlled behavior and how behavior our environment ultimately controlled our behavior as well.
Yeah.
And what I came to the realization is that the environment changes our biochemistry. The biochemistry changes our behavior. People seem to think that we have, quote, free will. Einstein knew we did not have free will. Watson and Crick knew we did not have free will. Even John Calvin knew we did not have free will. Free will is a construct that has been created by society to punish criminals. The fact of the matter is, our hormones tell us what to do. Anthony Cashmore, head of biology at the University of Pennsylvania, basically said that it ultimately, free will is the interaction between our DNA and our environment with some random stochastic processes thrown on top. Well, the random stochastic processes are random. You can't control them. The genetics are fixed. You can't do anything about that. Well, that means that pretty much all you've got is your environment. And so my interest has been in how does the environment change our biochemistry, and how does that ultimately impact on what we think and do in the world?
Yeah.
And that is how I got from brain tumors to technology. So a hormone is a chemical that is made in one part of the body and acts in another. There are glands that make hormones all over the body. The one that you referred to is cortisol, which is made by a gland called the adrenal gland, which sits on top of your kidneys. It is your stress gland. It is the gland that helps you run away from the lion when you're on the African savannah and it's chasing you. It's also the hormone that helps you pass your English test, but it's also the hormone that gives you post-traumatic stress disorder. So, in an acute situation, cortisol is a good hormone because it alerts you, it activates you, it makes you ready for the stress and danger of, acute living. But in the long term, it actually fries your brain.
Right.
And we all now suffer from fried brain because of chronic stress and chronic cortisol activation of our limbic system, the area of the brain that controls emotions.
And how does the cortisol fry your brain exactly? Like, what's the mechanism?
So what cortisol does is it requires extra energy.
Yeah.
So if your neurons can put out that energy, then it won't fry. But if there's something inhibiting those neurons from being able to put out more energy, then those neurons are particularly susceptible. Of all the areas of the body, the brain is the most susceptible to lack of either glucose or oxygen, and your brain will shut down within 4 minutes, as opposed to any other part of your body, which can live for an hour, sometimes much longer, without glucose or oxygen. The brain is particularly susceptible to energy deficits. So the other thing is that there's no storage place for energy in the brain. Mm-hmm. So the only way the brain gets the energy is through the bloodstream. So what's happening peripherally ultimately impacts on how well the brain can function. So hypoglycemia, for instance, low blood glucose, will cause all sorts of behavioral problems, and pretty immediately. Right. One of the things we do when a kid drowns is cool that kid in order to try to reduce energy metabolism in the brain until we can get them on a bypass machine or fully oxygenated, and then we can try to rewarm it slowly in an attempt to try to salvage those neurons. So there are parts of the brain that are particularly susceptible to energy imbalance and energy deficit, and they will result in significant damage. Interesting. One area that's famous for this is the hippocampus. So the hippocampus is the memory center. It is the part of your brain that remembers when you put your hand on that hot stove when you were 3 years old. Don't do that, because that's not such a good idea. And it's wired to the rest of your brain that basically tells you, don't do that. Right. And it's in particular, it's in reciprocal connection with the amygdala. Yeah. The amygdala is the fear center. So the hippocampus is the memory center. The amygdala is the fear center. And then there's a third area that forms this general circuit, and that's the prefrontal cortex. So if you're walking down a deserted alley at 3 a.m, right, and you have this sense of dread, right, that's the amygdala firing. Mm-hmm. Your prefrontal cortex will try to tamp that down and say, there's nobody there. It's okay. I'll make it to the end of that alley. Right. The hippocampus says, oh, I've walked this, countless times before. I remember that this is really just a deserted alley, not a place where, some perpetrator is going to jump out of a door and, attack me. Mm-hmm. So these are tamped down effects on the amygdala. Mm-hmm. The problem is the longer the amygdala runs, the higher the cortisol goes, and the more likely that both the hippocampus will get damaged because now it needs more energy, and the more likely that the prefrontal cortex will become dysfunctional because cortisol turns off that prefrontal cortex. So chronic stress, because of these long-term effects, can basically disinhibit the fear and anxiety pathway in the brain. And that's why chronic stress is causing all of the problems that we currently see today.
Right. So essentially high cortisol, chronically high cortisol, because cortisol essentially is designed to spike and help us fight or fly or do whatever we need to do to survive and then go back to normal. And in our current societies, the problem is that this doesn't tend to happen. We tend to have chronic stress, so chronic cortisol over a long period of time. And you're saying that that chronic cortisol increase can actually damage your prefrontal cortex and your hippocampus. And I think that there's quite a strong link between high levels of chronic stress and cortisol and, for instance, dementia or memory problems. And, it affects your memory, which is activated by the hippocampus, but also your prefrontal cortex, which is sort of your executive function, which helps you plan and organize your life and be disciplined.
The prefrontal cortex is the part of your brain that makes you human.
Right.
Because it's the part of the brain that helps you see the future.
Right.
Other species have a prefrontal cortex, but it's very rudimentary.
Right.
It is also the last part of your brain to develop.
Right.
It's the last part evolutionarily to develop, because we have a big one and the rest of the species has a very little one. And it is the part of the brain that is last to myelinate. Right. That is the fatty sheaths that surround neurons that protect them from damage. And it doesn't happen completely until age 25.
Right.
And the actuaries know this, because that's why they start lowering the automobile insurance rates, premiums, after age 25, because that's when teenagers realize they really are mortal.
Right, which is a good thing.
Well, it's not a good thing that it takes till 25.
No, it's really not. And this is probably why there's so many fatal accidents and terrible tragedies that happen to young men, especially. And I've heard that female prefrontal cortexes tend to myelinate slightly earlier. I don't know if that's
earlier,
true.
not very much.
Not
very much so.
Okay.
But it is true that the prefrontal cortex is easily damaged before the myelin sheath gets formed.
Interesting.
And so adolescents are at particular risk and particularly susceptible to environmental damage of various sorts.
Interesting.
And therefore, they're also more susceptible to virtually every mental illness, whether it be attention deficit disorder, schizophrenia, addiction, depression, anxiety. All of those run in adolescence, more so even than they do in adulthood.
And what are the particular things that can damage the prefrontal cortex before it's formed? I mean, stress being one of them, presumably cortisol.
So adverse childhood experiences with chronically elevated cortisol from the childhood experiences clearly damage the prefrontal cortex, lead to susceptibility for addiction later on. This is well known in the psychiatric literature. Chronic stress alters prefrontal cortical neural networks and prevents the synapse formation. So it alters how the prefrontal cortex ultimately interacts with the rest of the brain, basically disinhibiting the rest of the brain, including, for instance, the reward center, which is the dopamine center, which we'll talk about, I'm sure, in a moment. And that, precipitates the possibility of addiction.
Interesting.
We now know in humans that the literacy environment of a family impacts on white matter integrity even before school age.
Wow.
So basically setting you up and putting you at risk for later damage. So, this goes way back and, probably even in utero. These issues. One of the things that delays that myelinization is marijuana. And we are legalizing marijuana all over the place, including, for instance, California. And for adults, that's probably not terrible. And the way we know that is because in the 7 states in the United States that have legalized marijuana in the last several years, what we've seen is as marijuana sales have gone up, SSRI, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor for depression, have gone down reciprocally. Wow. So basically people are choosing one anti-anxiety agent that they can control over another one that has to be prescribed that they can't control.
Interesting.
So people are just voting with their feet.
Absolutely.
But what it's saying is that we've got an anxiety problem.
Well, exactly.
But it's probably not a good idea to let your kids smoke marijuana for their anxiety.
Absolutely. And so what are the other things, apart from cortisol and marijuana, that can damage the prefrontal cortex and sort of disinhibit?
So obviously chronic stress through cortisol and through its own effects on corticotropin releasing factor, a different hormone in the brain. Various other drugs. So There are two kinds of drugs. There are drugs that are excitatory, and there are drugs that are inhibitory. Now, neurons like to be excited. That's why they have receptors for excitatory neurotransmitters.
Right.
They like to be stimulated, and then they like to go back to rest, just like the cortisol story. When you have stress, then it's supposed to go back to baseline. So neurons like to be excited, but they like to be tickled, not bludgeoned. Chronic overstimulation of any neuron will lead to neuronal cell death. Basically, they run out of energy. They fire so often, they can't make energy fast enough for the continued firing process. And so they basically run out of energy. And so chronic overstimulation of any neuron will lead to neuronal cell death. And we know this because as a pediatrician, I took care of numerous children over my career in status epilepticus, that is, chronic seizures that wouldn't stop, where we had to admit them to the intensive care unit, put them into a pentobarbital coma to basically stop their seizures, stop all their neurons from firing, while we got hold of the epileptogenic focus to stop those chronic seizures so that no more damage would be done. Otherwise, the kids would end up severely delayed.
Brain damage, yeah.
So, neurons don't want to be overstimulated.
Right.
Now, not all drugs stimulate neurons. Some drugs inhibit neurons. Example, GABA, gamma-aminobutyric acid, and GABA agonists, like, for instance, benzodiazepines. So like Ambien or Valium or Halcion, okay? They do not do damage. They suppress neuronal activity. And if you're inhibiting, then you're not basically running out of energy, so you're not going to fry your brain. However, stimulatory drugs, so cocaine, amphetamine, PCP, those will damage neurons going forward.
Right.
And so that's where we get into trouble. And that's one, set of drugs that teenagers in particular should not be using.
And I would add that benzos also, even though they're inhibitory, can have some terrible effects.
Oh, absolutely. Well, virtually every drug has its side effect profile.
Exactly. And, especially with GABA, my understanding is that, GABA is also a natural neurotransmitter. And it's a calming neurotransmitter.
Right, it inhibits.
It inhibits, exactly. Right. And it's very important. And it's a neurotransmitter that we naturally make. And the issue with benzos, for instance, is that by taking benzos, you then downregulate your own capacity to make GABA. This is my understanding. So you create a long-term addiction where your own capacity to generate endogenous GABA is sort of compromised, essentially.
Right.
So
I don't know if we'd call it addiction, but certainly a dependence.
Right, a dependence, yeah. Right. Okay, so that's very interesting. So long-term stress, drugs, all these things can be very damaging to the brain, especially young brains.
Right. And what we're now learning is that technology can also be damaging to the brain through the same mechanisms, through the same excitation, through a neurotransmitter called dopamine.
Right.
So dopamine is the reward neurotransmitter. It is the learning neurotransmitter. It is the pleasure neurotransmitter. It is the neurotransmitter that gets you up in the morning. Yeah. It is the neurotransmitter that makes you go to work every day. It is the neurotransmitter that is the survival of the species, because it's the neurotransmitter that makes you want to have sex.
Yeah, it's a very important neurotransmitter.
No dopamine, species dies out.
Interesting.
All right?
Okay.
So you got to have it.
Yeah.
All right? And we're not trying to do away with it. But, you're not supposed to be in a constant state of reward.
Right.
But we are.
Right.
Now, we didn't used to be. And this is our current modern society. This is what has happened. And the reason is because reward used to be hard to find. Right. And it used to be expensive once you did find it. And now it's cheap.
Yeah.
And everyone can afford it. In fact, everyone can afford a lot of it.
Right. And give me some examples of sort of dopamine stimulating substances and behaviors.
All right. Well, so cocaine.
The common ones. Yeah.
Cocaine is a dopamine clearance inhibitor. So what happens is the dopamine goes into the synapse and then it doesn't get recycled. It doesn't get cleared. So it raises the levels within the synapse. So that's one reason why cocaine addicts like it.
Right.
Because you get lots of reward. So methamphetamine, ecstasy, PCP, all are dopamine stimulators.
Yeah.
But there are behaviors too. Shopping,
Yeah.
gambling, internet gaming,
Yeah.
social media, pornography.
Yeah.
So you can have addictive substances because of dopamine. You can have addictive behaviors because of dopamine. It's the same pathway. It's the same circuit. It's the same problem. And it comes from not just dopamine, because that's learning. It's dopamine and cortisol. Together. And the reason is because that prefrontal cortex is now inhibited. And so now your reward center is going, six gun shooting.
Interesting. So if you explain that mechanism, so it's the combination of cortisol with dopamine, excess dopamine. And would you say what comes first? Is it because you're stressed that you then resort to trying to boost your dopamine? Or is it just because, how is there a chicken and egg thing?
It's both.
It's both.
It's both. It could be that stress leads you to try to reward yourself as a modality for dealing with the stress.
Yeah.
Or it could be that the modality of reward ultimately leads to the stress, especially the way it is being used by corporations.
Yeah.
So, the corporations are basically selling pleasure as happiness, and what they're doing is they're actually stressing you.
Completely. And I love that in your book, because you talk all about the fact that, in fact, in our current societies led by advertising and corporations, we are led to believe that happiness, in fact, equates to pleasure. And that basically we're taught by corporations that if we pursue this type of pleasure, whether it's sex or alcohol or, doing whatever it is that we're seeking as a sort of short-term pleasure, is going to make us happy. When in fact, biochemically, the opposite is true, because
That's
pleasure boosts our dopamine, which then downregulates our serotonin, which is the happiness neurotransmitter.
That word contentment, right.
Right.
So basically, the thing we're all seeking, that is happiness. And you ask anybody what it is that they really want, they want to be happy.
Right.
The fact of the matter is that pleasure, while a short-lived signal that's valuable, and I'm not discounting that, I'm kind of partial to it myself. But ultimately, chronic pleasure, chronic reward, chronic dopamine actually downregulates serotonin.
Yeah.
And what you see is in states where you have high dopamine, low serotonin, what you end up with are compulsive behaviors, which is sort of what everyone now is evidencing.
So things like OCD, for instance, obsessive compulsive disorder, which is a subset of anxiety, essentially.
Yes.
Would you say that is characterized by high dopamine and low serotonin?
That's exactly what it is.
Yeah.
And you can put yourself into it very easily. Right. I'll give you an example. Infatuation. Thank you. So there's a difference between love and in love. Yes. And I outline this in the book.
Brilliant.
Love is serotonin. Yeah. Contentment, being at peace with a partner, with the world, with oneself. Yeah. And that is clearly a valuable emotion, a valuable feeling, a valuable experience. And then there's in love. And in love is a disaster.
Yep.
Okay?
Yep.
In love, you do all sorts of dumb things.
Exactly.
Okay? And you're miserable doing it. Yep. And you have no choice.
Exactly.
Okay? Yep. And it drives you insane. And it drives everyone around you insane. Exactly. Okay? And no matter what happens, you will not be happy because you are seeking this reward. Whether it's appropriate or not is irrelevant.
Right. Totally. So it's completely driven by dopamine, essentially. Totally. but then it downregulates serotonin. So
Right.
the irony is if you're completely madly in love with someone over time and this infatuation continues, you're actually long-term going to be less happy.
Without question.
Yeah, which is
Without
very
question.
interesting. And our society in many ways conflates being in love with love. I mean, it's very difficult, I think, to convey.
Just read a romance novel and you'll
Completely.
figure out why.
Although I would argue Shakespeare, Romeo and Juliet. I mean, that's
it goes way back.
A long way.
It sure does.
So coming back to neurotransmitters and hormones, I mean, that's obviously what we've been talking about. But in terms of common mental health disorders, so things like depression, anxiety, insomnia, addiction, etc., a lot of these are very biochemically driven. And so
they're all biochemically
driven.
Okay. Every thought is the phosphorylation of a protein.
Right.
Every behavior is a neurochemical reaction in the brain. Now, sometimes we're smart enough to be able to figure out what that is. Yeah. Sometimes not. But ultimately, there is no thought.
Yeah.
There is no action. There is no behavior without the biochemistry.
Exactly.
And what we have learned is that the environment plays a major role in that biochemistry.
Completely. Epigenetics, essentially.
Among other things.
And the environment in terms of our lifestyle and our behavior, what we eat, how we sleep, how we exercise, all these things are hugely important to regulating our biochemistry. And I think this is what I'm particularly interested in, because in the way that we treat mental health at the moment, most of the time, if you're depressed or anxious or insomniac, you'll go to your psychiatrist and they'll either prescribe an SSRI, an antipsychotic, an antidepressant, essentially, and maybe a sleeping pill, and they'll probably prescribe some talk therapy if you're lucky.
If you're lucky.
And
that costs money.
Right. But essentially what they're doing is they're treating, in terms of the antidepressants, the symptoms rather than the causes.
Exactly right. They are treating the symptom, not the cause.
Exactly.
And this is actually the problem with modern medicine.
Right.
Yes, we have gotten very good at determining the mechanism of specific disease processes, but that does not necessarily relate to what the cause of that mechanism is.
Exactly.
So we can understand the pathophysiology. We can understand, okay, yes, this neurotransmitter is involved in this, or this hormone is involved in this, or this biochemical in your body is involved in this. And we can target a drug at that particular pathway.
Right.
But if that's already happening, horse is out of the barn.
Right.
The problem's already there.
Exactly.
And it's probably doing damage upstream, and all you're doing is working on the manifestation of that downstream.
Right.
So you're not really solving the problem. You're papering it over.
You're papering over, and you might even be creating further problems.
Potentially.
Because there's so many side effects to
That's
a lot of these drugs.
Like, for instance, statins, they lower your LDL. The question is, do they actually fix your heart disease? No. And they could potentially actually raise your blood sugar and cause diabetes.
Right. And
so
also,
that's not necessarily a win-win.
Well, and also with SSRIs, for instance, you can have, suicidal ideation, weight gain, loss of libido. I mean, there are quite a few side effects.
And also atypical antipsychotics. Yeah. So the things that we use as mood stabilizers cause severe liver insulin resistance, high insulin levels, and cause weight gain, numerous other manifestations of metabolic syndrome, and other altered behaviors.
Exactly. So, I mean, my big thing is, and, a lot of functional medicine doctors and integrative mental health specialists, which is the area of medicine that I'm particularly interested in, are big advocates of going to the root cause and saying, okay, let's look at mental health from a root cause perspective, and let's try and figure out why your serotonin is low, why your cortisol is high, why your dopamine is high, etc. Right. And so these are the things that I'm particularly interested in. One of the interesting things is also the link between hormones and neurotransmitters. So, for instance, progesterone affects GABA. Mm-hmm. So progesterone, which is one of the female sex hormones, is very important as a precursor,
So it's actually not progesterone affecting GABA, but a metabolite of progesterone binds to the GABA receptor. Okay. So progesterone can be turned into a neurotransmitter in the brain called allopregnanolone.
Okay.
And allopregnanolone is a GABA agonist by itself.
Interesting.
And so it will bind to the GABA receptor and act like Ambien.
Right. So it calms you down. Yeah.
So when progesterone is high, you sometimes get that feeling, and Some people think that premenstrual syndrome, as an example, which occurs at a time when progesterone levels should be high, might be related to inappropriate progesterone levels.
Right. And also perimenopause, for instance, where your progesterone levels go down.
Right.
Women can suffer anxiety, but also postpartum depression.
Indeed.
And, at the postpartum period where your progesterone is going to be lower, you can suffer from extreme anxiety.
Absolutely. In addition, estrogen will change where you are on your dopamine response curve.
Right.
So this gets a little, shall we say, politically incorrect, but hopefully your audience will tolerate this for a minute. Okay, there are some women who function better in social situations during their ovulatory period, and there's some women who function better when they're not in their ovulatory period. And the reason is because it depends where you are on your dopamine response curve. Dopamine is kind of a squirrely neurotransmitter, and here's why. A normal drug response, a dose response for a drug, is what we call a sigma curve. So you start when the concentrations are low, the effect is low, and then the concentration builds up and you start getting an effect, and then you reach saturation and you get a shoulder, and then you finally get a plateau. Yeah. That's known as a sigma response curve. Okay. And pretty much virtually every drug on the planet follows this sigma response curve, except dopamine.
Really?
So for dopamine, it is a bell-shaped response curve. There is a point in the middle of the response curve where you reach maximal effect. Okay? As opposed to, say, the sigma response curve where you need more dose to get the top effect. Here, you might actually need less dose to get the top effect. And in that middle of that bell-shaped curve, you are fun, you are focused, you are friggin' phenomenal. Okay, you are the life of the party. Okay, and everyone wants to be there.
Right.
And if you're not, there are things you can do to try to move yourself along that dopamine response curve in either direction. So, for instance, if you're lethargic, you might drink some alcohol because that will disinhibit that prefrontal cortex, drive the dopamine, and put you up higher on that dopamine response curve. On the other hand, if you are on the irritable side, you might take a benzo in order to try to calm you down, to bring you back down, because any more dopamine will send you into irritability. Right. So on the left side of that bell-shaped curve, you are lethargic. On the right side of that dopamine response curve, you are irritable. And then there's this place right in the center, the sweet spot. And everyone wants to be there. And they will do anything to make it happen, including taking drugs.
Interesting. And then the other interesting thing is the relationship, I think, between estrogen and serotonin. So if my understanding is correct, high levels of estrogen can correlate to higher levels of serotonin and vice versa.
Yes.
Which is also why during menopause or perimenopause or postpartum, low levels of estrogen can correlate with depressive mood, essentially, depressed mood.
Sure. Also the stress, which will reduce serotonin receptors. So chronic stress and cortisol lower the serotonin 1A receptor, which is the receptor for contentment, for calm, for relaxation, for feeling at one with the world. And if you have fewer molecules of serotonin and fewer receptors as well, now you have depression.
So you have the perfect storm, essentially. And I keep coming back to postpartum depression because it's an obvious example. It's what I suffered from. But so essentially lower levels of estrogen will mean that you have fewer molecules of serotonin floating around. And then chronic stress from having this baby that you have to look after, or, chronic stress in your life due to this big life change will then sort of downregulate your receptors. So all in all, you become quite depressed.
Right. So the placenta is a lean, mean estrogen machine. Okay, it makes estrogen nonstop.
Right.
And the reason it's doing that is because it is going to the uterus and causing the uterus to build up in terms of the muscle fibers in order to be able to push that baby out.
Right.
Okay. Well, that and progesterone is also high because that's actually keeping the muscles from contracting and expelling the baby before it's time.
Right.
So those two hormones are pretty darn important in terms of getting that baby all the way through and getting out. But then baby leaves, cut the cord, estrogen levels fall like a stone.
Right.
And that can precipitate all sorts of problems in the mother.
Right.
And certainly postpartum depression is a pretty common manifestation. Some doctors will tell you that every mother suffers from, some level of it. Okay. Some, clinically significant, some less clinically significant. But that estrogen drop, just because of the cutting of the cord, will lead to some behavioral changes all by itself. And you want to have a low estrogen level during the first few months because you're trying to lactate, you're trying to make milk, and the more estrogen, the less, likely you'll be able to engage in lactation. So there's all sorts of reasons why these things happen when they do, and there's value to them, but sometimes it gets in our way.
Out of control. And also, I think, not just postpartum, but also different life cycles and, female, whether it's puberty or whether it's postpartum or whether it's menopause or perimenopause. And I think maybe that's why 4 times more women suffer from mental health issues than men. Having said that, testosterone essentially, in my understanding, and I'm not sure how this works, but men apparently can get depressed because their testosterone is low.
Absolutely. And, the question is, why is their testosterone low? Well, it's a function of aging to some extent, but it's also a function of chronic stress.
Right.
So chronic stress will impact on the hormones that drive the hypothalamus to make the pituitary, to make the testicle work. And so levels of testosterone will fall, which will increase fatigue, will reduce libido, will, basically make men more depressed. So that's certainly something that happens over the course of a lifetime, what we call the andropause for men.
Yeah.
There's the menopause for women, the andropause for men.
Right.
So it's not like men get off scot-free.
No, of course. And then let me ask you about 2 other hormones. So DHEA, which is another steroid hormone, which is involved in the immune system and sort of and higher in young people and then lowers as you age.
That's what it seems like.
It seems like, but then it's inversely related to cortisol. Is this correct, or how does it work? No, tell us. It's not
related to cortisol at all.
At all. Okay, but it is a steroid hormone.
It's a steroid hormone that is still looking for its function. Yes, it has been noted that older people have lower DHEA levels.
Yeah.
There is some data that suggests that DHEA may be important in mitochondrial metabolism.
Okay.
That actually came from the Prader-Willi syndrome literature because they have very low DHEA levels. DHEA sulfate is actually is only made in the adrenal, is used in the brain as a method for increasing synapse formation.
Interesting.
And so that might be relevant in terms of how the adrenal and the brain also communicate. But DHEA and cortisol are not specifically
related.
They both come from the adrenal gland, but they're not specifically related because they're coming from 2 different pathways.
Okay.
DHEA is coming from what we call the delta 5 pathway. The cortisol is coming from what we call the delta 4 pathway. Okay. And they're actually sort of not related.
Okay.
And they're not under the same regulatory mechanisms.
But DHEA is a precursor to testosterone and estrogen?
Yes. So DHEA gets converted to androstenedione, which gets converted to testosterone, which then gets converted to estradiol.
Right.
That is true.
Yeah.
But it's through a different pathway than cortisol and in a different part of the adrenal gland.
Yeah.
So the DHEA is made in a part of the adrenal called the reticularis.
Right.
The cortisol is made in a part of the adrenal called the fasciculata.
Okay.
The aldosterone, the soul-retaining hormone, is made in a part of the adrenal called the glomerulosa.
Okay.
So almost 3 different stratifications and 3 different sets of stimulatory mechanisms.
Yeah.
So they really are not the same. You could almost consider those 3 layers of the adrenal as 3 separate glands.
Yeah. Understood. And it's very interesting because, coming back to mental health, like, do DHEA levels impact on mental health? And I suppose indirectly, insofar as they impact on testosterone and estrogen.
It may impact directly.
Yeah,
we don't know that yet.
Right.
This is hypothesis,
Yeah.
Not proven.
Right.
We don't yet know whether DHEA supplementation actually makes a difference in terms of mental health.
Yeah.
So you can buy DHEA at the health food store.
Yeah.
But at this point in time, it's still conjecture as
Understood.
to how well it works or whether it works at all.
Understood. And then the final hormone I'm really interested in is oxytocin, which is sort of the love and bonding hormone.
Love and bonding, yes.
Yeah.
So they say.
Yeah. So
bonding anyway.
Yeah, bonding.
And
anyway.
of course, absolutely essential for uterine contraction.
Yeah.
And also related to lactation, nipple discharge of milk.
Yeah. But so oxytocin, how is it related to serotonin? Is there
that I know of.
Not that we know of.
Not that I know of.
Because they'll say that, for instance, there was a study done on prisoners that showed that if they were given oxytocin, that they became much calmer and less aggressive, etc.
Well, oxytocin has an effect on bonding, which
Yeah.
might, have some relation. I don't know that it works through serotonin per se.
Okay.
It has its own behavioral effects, which we certainly know through the maternal literature.
Understood.
But I don't necessarily know that it's mediated through serotonin.
So if we look at, we've sort of covered all the hormones, and we've looked at.
Oh, there are more yet to go.
There are a lot more, but
there are about 45.
Yeah, you're right. But sort of the main ones that we think of when we think of mental health, essentially, and we've covered a few of the neurotransmitters, and I think one of the things in terms of mental health is how do we better balance our hormones and neurotransmitters, because essentially depression, anxiety, insomnia are often the symptoms of a sort of imbalance in hormones and in neurotransmitters. So either hormone or neurotransmitter is too high or it's too low.
Right.
And so presumably in terms of treating the root cause of these mental health issues, what we need to do is really balance these hormones and neurotransmitters. And
Easier said than done.
But look at all the factors that impact them and try and address those factors and intervene in ways that will balance them so that we're calmer and happier and more regulated.
Indeed.
So in terms of practical solutions, sort of your top 5 tips for how to balance these hormones and these neurotransmitters.
What do you do?
Yeah, what do you do? Exactly.
Right. So let's start out by saying what you want to do is you want to tamp down your dopamine, you want to tamp down your cortisol, and you want to raise your serotonin.
Yeah.
Okay? Pretty much everybody wants to do those 3 things.
Okay.
And the question is, how do you do that?
Yeah.
Okay.
And what about GABA? Would you raise GABA as well?
Well, I don't know of any behavioral modality that specifically raises GABA. Right. You can take benzos, that'll, they're GABA agonists, but I don't know of any specific way to sort of modulate that. We'll talk about meditation in a minute and what it does.
Right.
So, getting your serotonin up, I don't know of any drug that does that.
Which is interesting. What about SSRIs?
So, okay. Let me back that up. Okay.
Not that I'm for SSRIs, because
behavioral.
I'm not.
I was talking about behavioral.
Yes.
Behavioral way.
Yeah.
So I can only think of behavioral ways to get your serotonin up.
Okay.
Drug ways would be like, yes, SSRIs would raise serotonin by decreasing uptake, serotonin reuptake.
Yeah.
So basically, you're not clearing it, so it stays in the synapse.
Right.
So you can do
but
that.
It doesn't work for everybody.
It only
Some
works.
people don't respond.
It only works for about 25% of people, in fact.
Right.
So there's a reason why I think that that's the case, and that's because not everybody actually has a serotonin deficiency. Mm-hmm. So there are 2 kinds of depression.
Yeah.
There's a depression called endogenous or melancholic depression,
right,
which is absolutely no doubt 100% serotonin deficiency.
Interesting. Okay.
And serotonin reuptake inhibitors work well for melancholic depression.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there is this short-term worry that if you put a clinically depressed, melancholic depressed patient on an SSRI, they will commit suicide.
Right.
And we're still trying to figure out exactly why that is. Some people think, well, they finally have enough energy to actually do it. Whether that's true or not, I think is still open to question. But without doubt, if you give a melancholic depressive an SSRI, they will improve.
Right.
But then 75% of the depression in America and around the world, here in the UK too, is what we call atypical depression.
Right.
They're not the same.
Mm.
Melancholic depression, you don't want to eat.
Right.
You have no interest in eating.
Right.
You waste away. It turns out your cortisol levels are super high. You end up losing subcutaneous fat because you're not eating, but you lay down extra visceral fat.
Mm.
So if you stick a patient with melancholic depression in an MRI scanner, you will actually see increased
Visceral
belly fat, even though they've lost their subcutaneous fat.
And the visceral
because of the
fat
cortisol.
comes from the cortisol.
Comes
right.
from the cortisol,
Yeah.
driving energy deposition into fat, because that's one of cortisol's famous effects.
Right.
Steroid overdose, autoimmune disease, or anti-inflammatory. If you're on chronic steroids, you gain weight and you gain belly fat
Visceral
in particular.
fat. Yeah.
So melancholic depression is definitely serotonin deficiency, but this atypical depression, it's different because they're not eating; they're eating more.
Right.
In fact, they're using food as an attempt to try to mitigate their depression, okay, as opposed to the melancholic patients. And it looks like SSRIs don't work nearly as well in atypical depression.
Which is 75%.
Which is 75%.
And of the 25% of the melancholic depression that do work on SSRIs, how much of that is placebo? Presumably the placebo effect is about 30%.
It may be a little bit less in that. So, I mean, the SSRI effect appears to be quite real in that melancholic group.
Okay.
In the atypical group, there's a placebo effect for sure. So, how big that effect is, I'm not a psychiatrist, so I can't answer that specifically.
Right.
What I can say is that the thing that's really driving the atypical depression is the cortisol and the insulin resistance. And a lot of the insulin resistance is being generated by the food you eat in an attempt to try to stave off that atypical depression.
Interesting.
So it tends to be a vicious cycle.
Yeah.
Yes. So, and that's one of the reasons why SSRIs don't work, because it's not really a serotonin problem per se.
Right. Yeah.
The serotonin might actually be the result of the problem, not the cause.
Okay.
So getting the cortisol down is really the problem,
The key.
the issue. And that means stress reduction. And that's really where, these 4 behaviors that I've identified in the book live. So no one wants to take drugs if they don't have to.
No.
And I agree with that. I'm not for drugs if behavior can do it itself. I mean, I use drugs when we need to, but only when we need to.
Yeah, agreed.
So there are 4 behaviors that I have delineated in the book that have evidence base for being able to tamp down dopamine, tamp down cortisol, and raise serotonin.
Yeah.
And I call these 4 behaviors the 4 C's.
Mm-hmm.
So the first one, connect.
Yeah.
Now, connect does not mean Facebook.
Mm.
Connect means what you and I are doing right now,
Mm-hmm.
face-to-face, eye-to-eye connection.
Right.
Okay, in conversation.
Yeah.
Why? Why does that raise serotonin? And the answer is because when you do this, that we're doing right now, you have a set of neurons in the back of your head in your occipital lobe called mirror neurons. These you can record from them. And what they are doing is they are reading the facial expressions of the person you are talking to in real time. And those neurons are transducing those facial expressions into your own emotion.
Uh-huh.
It is changing your personal emotion based on what the other person fed back to you.
Interesting.
So we have a name for this.
Mm.
In English, we call it empathy.
Right.
This is empathy, this phenomenon of increasing serotonin in response to another person's emotion.
Interesting.
Right? And if you're not doing it eye to eye, you're not using those mirror neurons. So you can't do it digitally.
Okay.
Which is why it doesn't mean Facebook.
So essentially, when you do it digitally, there's no increase in empathy, there's no increase in serotonin.
Right.
And so have they measured that? Have they measured that there's no increase in serotonin when you connect digitally? Okay.
Right. And all it does is raise your dopamine.
Because you could think that maybe it would increase serotonin because you're still having a nice exchange with someone, even though it's electronic.
Yeah. It's not nearly as effective.
As powerful, yeah.
So the connection has to be in person.
Okay.
And those facial expressions convey information. And we know that because Paul Ehrlich, famous UCLA Berkeley psychologist from the 60s, by the way, still alive, and actually a friend, went to Papua New Guinea, and they'd never seen a white person, but they had the same facial expressions for the same emotions that we did.
Interesting.
It's baked into our DNA.
Mm.
We didn't learn it from somebody. It's already there. So those facial expressions are how we communicated before there was language. So they're pretty important, and we have been circumventing them.
Right.
So connect.
Through digital, sort of circumventing them through digital and technology. And,
that's right. Yeah. And it's very important for kids in particular to learn this skill. Yeah. And they are not learning it because they're busy on their screens.
Yeah, agreed.
As Sherry Turkle, a famous media watcher at MIT, famously said, if we don't teach our kids how to be alone, they will always be lonely.
And I love that quote, and it's in your book, and it's absolutely brilliant because our kids are never alone. They're constantly connected, and they're constantly texting.
Well, they're not connected the right way.
And they're not connected the right way. And they're never bored either. I mean,
Piaget famously said that play is the work of the child. I would add to that, boredom is the opportunity of the child.
Yeah.
If you don't let your kid be bored, then don't expect them to be very creative either.
Completely. Yeah. Well, I mean, creativity comes from necessity, and necessity comes from boredom, essentially. Yeah.
Exactly.
Completely.
So that's number one. Yeah. Number two, contribute.
Mm-hmm.
And that does not mean to your IRA or 401k. Has nothing to do with money.
Yeah.
And actually, the contribution has to come from yourself to others.
Yeah.
It has to be a selfless contribution.
Right.
So volunteerism, philanthropy. Now, everyone always asks me, well, can you do contribution through work? And the answer is yes, you can. And I do that.
Yeah.
If two criteria met. Number one, you can see how your work helps others because it's got to be selfless.
Yeah.
And number two, your boss can see it too.
Interesting.
Okay, which is not always the case.
And why is it that your boss has to be able to see it too? Because then you get the sort of
you get the bennies out of it.
They get the benefits. Okay.
Right. Otherwise, you're stressed.
Yeah.
And then,
I mean, the only thing is then that's all external, right? Sort of gain as opposed to coming from within.
Right. It's got to come from within, but you have to be left alone to do it.
Okay.
Number three.
Yeah.
Cope.
Uh-huh.
And this is where all of these modalities that you were talking about. So sleep, mindfulness, and exercise are all in the grab bag of cope.
Okay.
And they all do the same thing. They tamp down cortisol.
Interesting.
And by tamping down cortisol, we increase serotonin 1A receptors, thereby increasing serotonin activity.
Interesting.
So,
and I would add to that also, from reading your book, that not doing too much technology would be included in the sort of sleep, exercise, mindfulness.
Oh, absolutely. That's mindfulness.
And then, not having such a huge relationship with technology, essentially, where you're constantly on these screens.
Correct. Yeah. So the single worst word in the English language is multitasking.
Mm.
Everyone now has to multitask, except for one thing. No one can.
Right.
2.5% of the population can actually multitask.
Really? How do they know that?
Because they stuck people in an fMRI scanner to figure it out.
Interesting.
So that means 97.5% of people say they're multitasking, but aren't. What they're doing is they're serially unitasking.
Yeah.
And every time they switch from one task to another in their head, They lose 23 minutes of concentration, and they get a cortisol bump.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
So basically, you're frying your brain by trying to multitask.
But also, I've heard that it takes a lot of energy to switch from one task to the
because
other.
of the cortisol.
Interesting. So you're essentially depleting your brain energy.
Absolutely. Now, there are some people who can multitask.
2.5%, not very much.
A lot of them are pilots.
Yeah.
So pilots are sort of the ultimate multitaskers.
Interesting.
So you stick a pilot in an MRI machine and you measure their cerebral blood flow and their glucose utilization. And what you do is you add an extra task on after the last one to basically occupy the pilot to reach their max.
Right.
Okay. And everyone has a max.
Yeah.
Yeah. Some people have a bigger max than other people, but everyone, you can find that final, break point.
Yeah.
Where, they can't handle it anymore. And what they've shown is that at that point, when you have overwhelmed anybody's ability to multitask, cerebral glucose metabolism goes super high. Okay. Cortisol goes super high. And even the pilot will tell you that they are friggin' exhausted and they are fried. Okay. And you have basically done a pilot in.
Yeah.
Okay. Which is a hard thing to do.
Right. Okay. So a lot of sleep, the right amount of exercise, meditation and mindfulness, less technology, and no multitasking.
Right. There you go. Focus on either nothing,
right,
which we call meditation,
right,
or focus on one thing, which we call
work.
Living.
Living. Yeah. In an ideal world. You focus on one thing, right, and you're in the present moment. Yeah,
right.
Exactly.
That's right. Be in the present moment.
Yeah.
Something I've learned, which I would be happy to, inspire your audience. I'm a pretty anxious person, or at least I have been in the past. I'm much less anxious now. And it's because I learned something. And it took me a lot of years to learn it. Mm-hmm. I'm kind of annoyed that I didn't quite figure it out until recently. Mm. So I'm an anxious person. And what I've come to realize is anxiety is excitement about the future.
It's a good way of looking at it.
The problem is the future never comes. Because today you're anxious about what's going to happen tomorrow. Okay, now tomorrow comes. Now you're going to be anxious about what's going to happen the next day.
Completely. And
then the next day. Yeah. So tomorrow never comes because there's always another tomorrow, and, it just keeps propagating itself. And you can fry yourself pretty good that way.
Completely. And
I have. And it's only recently that I've come to realize that, living in the past makes you depressed. Living in the future makes you anxious. And if you live in the present, you have a half a chance of making it out alive.
So I always say that's why they call it the present, because it's a gift and you just have to rest in the present.
That's right.
And my mother's favorite expression was always, a coward dies 1,000 deaths, a brave man dies but one. And I thought that was wonderful. Yeah. Oh. Yeah. And very true. Similar
concept.
Yeah.
So that's number 3.
Yeah.
And finally, number 4, cook.
Yes.
Because serotonin is made from an amino acid in our diet called tryptophan. Mm-hmm. Tryptophan is an essential amino acid.
Right.
You have to eat it. You can't make it.
Uh-huh.
And it turns out it's the rarest amino acid.
Interesting.
Of all the amino acids, it is the one that is in the least amount in all of our foods.
Interesting.
The food that has the most is eggs. Mm-hmm. And after that, fish, poultry.
Interesting.
Okay, not exactly processed food.
Right. Yeah.
So, you need tryptophan to make serotonin.
Right.
No tryptophan, no serotonin.
Right.
Well, it turns out that the tryptophan you do eat, only 0.5% of that serotonin actually gets to the brain and gets used for serotonin.
Wow.
90% of it stays in the gut, where it's used for other functions.
The tryptophan or the serotonin?
The serotonin that's made from the tryptophan.
From the tryptophan. So 98% stays in the gut.
90%.
90% stays in the gut.
And then another 9% go to the liver, where it gets inactivated to a byproduct called kyurenine.
Okay.
And so only a certain amount of tryptophan actually makes it into the bloodstream and goes to the brain. And then that has to go via an aromatic amino acid transporter to get into the brain. And that's easily blocked by phenylalanine and tyrosine, 2 other amino acids. So getting tryptophan from the outside world into your central nervous system to make serotonin, to make you content, is pretty damn hard.
Okay.
And it's easily perturbed.
Interesting.
Which is one reason why a lot of people find it so hard to be happy.
Very interesting. And the phenylalanine and the tyrosine, so they're 2 amino acids.
Yep.
And what are they in? They're
in
any
everything.
Other protein?
Yeah, they're in everything.
So
there's lots of it in everything. And tyrosine is the precursor to dopamine.
Right.
So no problem making dopamine.
Interesting. And so
just making serotonin.
It's tricky. So you basically, would you advise just eating eggs on their own? But I mean, then presumably eggs also have phenylalanine and tyrosine.
Yeah, they do. They do, but they happen to have more tryptophan, so that's a good thing.
And then you can also add to that, if you have gut issues and absorption and digestion issues, then that's going to further, hamper your ability to absorb.
Absolutely. So gut inflammation is going to impair on that, and that's one of the mind-gut connection issues that people like Emmer and Meyer and others have brought to the fore. So yes, I mean, if your gut's not working right, your brain's not going to work right either, and there are lots of reasons why.
Right.
Some people think, and this is conjecture at this point, we don't know this, that the serotonin actually doesn't go through the bloodstream to get to the brain. It actually goes through the afferent vagus to get to the brain. That's a question mark. We don't know that yet, but I've seen a paper or two examining that question. But nonetheless, somehow you got to get the serotonin up there.
Right.
And it ain't easy.
Right.
So coming by contentment is sort of an active pursuit.
Right.
And you have to do it right. And there ain't no drug for that.
Interesting. And so, but in terms of, so you've given us several ways to increase your serotonin. One of them is to reduce stress. The other one is to eat the right foods, etc. But it seems to me that given how difficult it is to sort of create serotonin from the foods that you eat, from what you're telling us, probably the better way is to really work on reducing your cortisol and reducing your stress levels.
I would argue that reducing your stress level has to be job one, especially in our environment.
Yeah. Okay.
Because what that will do is that will bring your prefrontal cortex back online.
Yeah.
And that will help tamp down your dopamine.
Right.
And when you reduce your cortisol, you'll increase your serotonin receptors. So you won't need as many molecules of serotonin because you'll be more receptive to the ones that you do have.
You do have, exactly.
So stress reduction is really paramount.
Yeah.
And of course, stress reduction seems to be the hardest thing we do nowadays.
Exactly. So sleep, exercise, mindfulness, meditation.
Which is why there's a whole industry on that now.
Yeah, exactly. Interesting. And then also looking after your gut and your gut health so that you can absorb the food that you do eat.
Sure.
And then having a balanced diet, which is less processed foods. And what would you say, though, to vegetarians? Because I've been interested in the statistics that a lot of young women who are vegetarians or vegan for moral reasons end up developing sort of eating disorders, which are the hallmark of which can be low serotonin, which then creates body dysmorphia.
Yes.
Now, there have been some sort of theories that, if they're not getting enough protein in their diet, and therefore I
think they're not getting enough tryptophan in their diet.
Exactly. Yeah.
The protein is not the real issue. I mean, serotonin, tryptophan is just one amino acid out of many, and it's the rarest one.
Right.
So if you actually look at the protein amount, it looks fine,
right?
But it's not all the same protein
type. But in terms of the examples you gave us, fish, poultry, and eggs.
Right. Those are vegan, not on they're not on the vegan diet.
Exactly. So how can you get tryptophan if you're a vegan?
Well, it's tough.
It's tough.
There are a few things you can't get. So you can't get vitamin B12.
Right.
You can't get omega-3s.
Yeah.
I mean, you can eat flax. Salmon, flax. I mean, the omega-3s are in marine life.
Yeah.
So that's kind of tough. Right. So I'm not a pro-vegan.
Right.
I am pro-real food.
Right.
But I am pro-serotonin. I'm pro-tryptophan. I am pro-omega-3s. I'm pro B12.
Right.
All of which, I'm pro vitamin D.
Yeah.
All of which are actually kind of hard to do.
Right.
On a vegan diet.
Okay, that's great. And then one final thing, and we're going to wrap up here, but in terms of dopamine. So dopamine, because of the excess in our society, so you showed us a little bit how to raise serotonin, but in terms of dopamine, your theory is that our society is way too prone to being sort of reward driven and having
At
too
the moment,
much dopamine.
it's all about immediate gratification.
Right.
Whatever happened to this notion of delayed gratification?
Right.
Did you ever hear of the marshmallow test?
Yes. Yeah.
So for
It's a
your
great
audience,
test. Yeah.
the marshmallow test, very simple test. You take a kid, okay, you sit him down, and you say, here, kid, here's a marshmallow. I'm leaving the room.
Yeah.
I'm coming back in 15 minutes. If there's still a marshmallow there, I'm going to give you 2.
Right.
And you leave.
Mm.
What does the kid do? If the kid has a normal cortisol and normal serotonin, the kid will wait.
Interesting.
If the kid doesn't, the kid's got jacked up dopamine right away.
Really?
Yep.
So
it takes deliberative thinking and turns it into intuitive thinking. It takes delayed gratification, turns it into immediate gratification.
And so they've measured the amounts of dopamine in these kids with the marshmallow test before and after, and they've measured the serotonin and cortisol.
Well, serotonin's harder to do.
Okay.
Because it's more spread out, but they've done the dopamine.
Okay, that's so interesting. And so if you have a kid who's been amped up on Fortnite, for instance, for days and days, and you put them in the marshmallow test, they're likely to fail because their dopamine is so high from the from the Fortnite playing.
Which generated cortisol.
Cortisol as well, exactly.
Right. Reward and stress. It's not reward, it's not stress, it's reward and stress.
And stress at the same time. So essentially, in a nutshell, to make sure that we reduce our dopamine, which is too high, it's to lower our stress and to stop pursuing reward and sort of transient and immediate pleasures, as opposed to looking for more contentment, long-term contentment.
And the way to do that is to turn off the TV and blacken your screen.
Okay, so that's the key. Any other tips on how to reduce dopamine?
Well, you don't want to reduce it completely. In Silicon Valley, in Silicon Valley right now, they're actually advocating dopamine fasts.
Really?
Yeah, 3 weeks of locking yourself in a room.
Really?
Okay, not even showering.
Really? In
order to allow your dopamine receptors to come back so you can feel something.
Right. Yeah. And you'll feel more for less, essentially. So when you've done your dopamine fast, then smaller things will make you feel pleasure. And so, a bite of delicious food, or it'll take a lot less to make you feel pleasure, which is what we should all be pursuing.
Well, I don't know about this dopamine fasting thing.
I think it sounds quite good. Well, look, this is fantastic. I think this has been so helpful, and you're brilliant and super interesting as always, Robert. You're incredible. And I think you've given us a lot to chew on and to think about, and we can't wait for your next book, which is coming out
March 2021.
March 2021. And
it doesn't have a title yet.
It doesn't have a title yet, but we know that we're excited to get this because it's going to be brilliant. And I hope that we've explained a little bit about, the role of neurotransmitters and hormones in mental health and what you can do to try and balance these hormones and neurotransmitters for better mental health. So thank you so much, Robert.
Oh, it's always my pleasure, Kiki.
Really grateful, and look forward to having you again when you publish this book, if not before.
Indeed.
Thank
I'll
you.
be delighted.
Thank you so much for listening to the Mind Health 360 show. I hope that we've helped you realize that mental health symptoms have root causes that can and need to be addressed in order to sustainably heal, and have given you some ideas about steps you, your loved ones, or clients may take to start their healing journey. Please share this interview with anyone you think may find it helpful, and don't forget to subscribe to keep up to date with our latest interviews on integrative mental health. If you want further information, please go to www.mindhealth360.com or find us on social media. This information is for educational purposes only and is not intended to diagnose or treat any disease or to replace medical advice. Please always consult your healthcare practitioner before discontinuing any medication or implementing any changes in your diet, lifestyle, or supplement program.